Hello and welcome everybody to this week's edition of the International Cannabis Conversation. My name is Chris Day, your host for this tour around the global cannabis world. Thanks so much to trichomes.com for helping us to host this every 2 weeks. Thanks to my partners at Gateway Proven Strategies, the global consulting firm that really helps bring a lot of these conversations together. And of course, the Global Cannabis Network collective members around the world to ensure that every week that we do this, we have great experts. With me this week is Robert Laurie. He is an international cannabis and psychedelics lawyer based out of Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. And in our pre-show prep, we were talking a little bit about his background and how he sees himself. And we were talking about, really, Robert, you're a cannabis risk analyst, sort of looking at the global landscape, how movements are happening, Canada's role in it. And not really so recently, you've been in the space for a lot longer than most, also looking at this sort of convergence point between cannabis and psychedelics. But before we dive too much into it, maybe give our audience a little bit of your background, sort of how you ended up where you're at, and then we'll get into the Q&A section of the discussion and where we're going. But thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, and it's absolutely wonderful to be here and have an opportunity to share a bit more about myself and what I'm up to and where we're going with all of this. My name is Robert Laurie. I'm a lawyer. I'm licensed in both England and Canada. I'm a medical cannabis patient advocate. I've been involved with constitutional and Canadian charter challenges against 3 levels of government with respect to reasonable, dignified patient access to cannabis. I've also been involved in corporate commercial and aspects of securities fraud, which is no shortage of in legal cannabis, as we've been seeing in Canada. And I'm a board advisor to a number of leading international cannabis and psychedelic groups, including MAPS Canada, the Canadian Psychedelic Association, Heroic Hearts Project UK, and Last Prisoner Project. And so that coupled with being a lawyer and an advisor and a consultant, and one of the rare anomalies of someone that kind of grew up in the legacy market space decades before any of this became legal. So I like to tell clients, and I have a reputation that I kind of have the game covered from Copperhead Road to Wall Street and back again.
Yeah, it's interesting to see like those folks who really have been engaged with the cannabis market and seen it really from, in the modern era anyway, start to present, right? Being able to understand that dynamic and how that all plays. And you know, when Canada first legalized at a national level and really pushed that forward, I think it was a bit of a surprise to the world at the time that it would be Canada that came out of the gates so strong. And then recently we were discussing, you know, I think it got, the industry got another boost through the pandemic, which wasn't necessarily anticipated, but I think helped continue to move that ball forward, right?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you just have to look at how cannabis has been regarded by government, regulators, law enforcement, academic, scientific community, and mainstream industry at large. And it's interesting to see how cannabis has evolved from most recently from being a medical treatment to a retail recreational product. And then most recently, because of the pandemic, cannabis was recognized in our country, and I believe it was one of the first medical health officers were regarding cannabis as an essential service. And they were equating it on par with keeping liquor stores open because of treating alcohol withdrawal. So to me, it was interesting seeing the justification for cannabis being regarded as an essential service. And so for someone like me, who I'm also a principal of a law firm, Ad Lucem Law Corporation, which exclusively works in regulated and emerging industries, of which this is all a part of, I can't tell you how much easier it was to appear before municipal and provincial licensing boards and lead off with, "It's a pleasure to appear before you again." However, unlike my last appearance, cannabis has now been regarded by government and regulators as an essential service. And to me, that's a lot easier than having to go back 20, 25 years and tell the story of how this restricted narcotic is actually a medical commodity and treatment, which has the power and the backing of our Constitution.
Yeah, I think, I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and we saw a similar path here in the state where it was deemed an essential service during the pandemic as well. And certainly I think it proved out to be so, and also through the medicinal approach, definitely helped further the notion that this is not a product that should be stigmatized. It's a product that should be regulated and taken care of, but in responsible fashions. Looking at the path that Canada has taken over the last 20 plus years, and then most recently over the last 5 or 6, there's a lot of folks that looked at Canadian investment into South America, what was deemed frequently as probably overreach geographically. Then I guess the question I have for you is, what is the next stage for Canada as the global markets expand? Some of that early mover advantage is in some cases been capitalized on and in others lost. So what is Canada's role moving forward, not just domestically, but in the global marketplace?
That's a great question. And, unfortunately, it's not a straightforward answer to your question, but
none of them ever are. So it gets boring if it's just easy.
You make a good lawyer, because lawyering is all about the right questions to get the right answers. So let me riff with this one here. So you got to remember that Canada was the first G7 country to legalize recreational cannabis. That's what happened in 2018. I mean, we had medical cannabis going back to at least 2001, like formally recognized by the courts and the jurisprudence, which that planted the seed to what became in 2018 legal recreational cannabis. But you'll notice that Canada does not ship retail recreational cannabis internationally, right? And so what you're seeing and happening in Latin America and Europe, you got to ask yourself, are these recreational cannabis industries that are burgeoning, or is the government slightly turning on the taps to allow nationally produced medical product that will be distributed throughout that particular nation state's medical system? And so you see Canada, and it was funny, I was in a commune in Nimbin, Australia as a guest of the Nimbin Hemp Embassy at Mardi Gras, and one of the fellas was like, "Mate, what's it like in Nanaimo?" And I was like, "That's where I live, and that's where Tilray's from." And we laughed because I said, "You couldn't grow cannabis outside in Nanaimo like you can." And I said, "When's Australia going to stop importing medical cannabis from Canada when you could produce medical cannabis domestically?" I said, "That's like bringing sand to the beach." And everybody laughed. So what I think is the reality is we saw first mover of people not knowing what's going on. They just saw it as, what? Cannabis is legalizing. I got to get in there and we'll just see blue skies. But what people aren't realizing is this creation of Canadian legalization still has to be done in a way that is commensurate with the United Nations conventions involving controlled drugs and substances and psychotropic substances and anti-trafficking initiatives. Those still exist. So ultimately, without with a failure to appreciate and a lack of understanding as to what are the existing landmines and international frameworks as it comes to banking, accounting, finance, and what actually can be done under the law nationally and internationally, that's where the money and the detail is, because not all companies are created equal, and not all of them will be in a position to actually engage with a local regulator and instill confidence that they know what they're doing, from a medical cannabis perspective, or at a later and evolved stage, recreational production, sales, processing, and distribution of it. So what we can learn from Canada, I think, is a justification of how to do this in a way that isn't going to completely shoot yourself in the foot with respect to how the international community regards you. So to sum up, I would argue that none of this is new. It's just new to money that is not familiar with or comfortable yet investing in the space. So you have an interesting mix of risk takers and entrepreneurs on one hand, but yet on the other side, you've got the traditional pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, big business, but you're noticing some of the biggest businesses like Apple and Amazon, and a colleague of ours, Bob, wrote about this recently.
Yes,
the tables are starting to turn. But ultimately, this is where I think we're moving towards evolved and very sophisticated markets that a quick buck and a fat margin are no longer there, because the companies that know what they're doing are struggling to be profitable in order to satisfy these international rules and regs that, again, aren't designed to make a industry commercially feasible and profitable at this stage due to legality.
Yeah, it is interesting to see like who thinks they're early adopters when, right? So early adoption into cannabis that's past, we're past that phase, but many people in these more mainstream sectors that are now coming in and verbalizing support want to be perceived as early adopters. But it is also interesting to me as I talk to people around the world, depending on which country they're in, of course, they've got their own acceptance curves domestically that fit within this global acceptance curve that's been growing for a while and is far from peaking. Like I think we've got quite a long time before we can say we've peaked and are on the downhill. But I do think you're right. Canada was definitely an early adopter, certainly within the G7. And then there are these subsequent curves that are occurring. And I guess that's what people pay folks like you and me for, right? Is helping to predict where those are going to be, how they're going to roll out, and what types of opportunities those exist.
But it's still technically illegal, right? So
depends on where you're at and how you define legal. I mean, that is
that piece, but I look at it like tech. We're at the Netscape Navigator Lycos days of web browsers, right? Yes. And let's
that's the Wayback Machine, Robert, mentioning Netscape.
Oh, totally. But you know what I'm saying is, call me when Microsoft shows up and when we start to have at least an understanding of what the playing field looks like, because again, the consequences for some of these first movers could very well be that the law or the regulation goes a different direction, and then that's coupled with retroactive enforcement by tax and federal authorities. I mean, it would probably be unlikely, but what's to say, given that there's a lot of regulatory and legal change, I'd say, that has to still happen before we really know who will be the clear winners and losers. But for right now, it's clear that if you're venturing into these spaces and you don't have proper experienced advisors that understand the board and understand how to how the score is and the game is played. Without that, it's akin to flying without radar. So
yep, which was done, but didn't always end well, right? So yeah, another sort of overlay that I know you're very involved in, that we've seen this shift of some of those who really were very early in the cannabis space have now shifted into more is this landscape generally called psychedelics at this point. It covers a lot of different things, but it seems like every conference that I look at that used to be a cannabis B2B show now is a cannabis B2B show, and they've got at least a day or two of programming around psychedelics. Why is that happening? What is the crossover point that exists between these two previously fairly distinct areas of business or opportunity?
well, there was a time when you could just hold a cannabis event and it would sell out. And there were one or two providers that were doing it in the early days, and then more and more started popping up. And sooner or later, people realized, well, there was too many. Mm-hmm. That is very much what happened with conferences and cannabis companies and licensing, that there were a lot of, in many respects, too many of them. And in 2019, that was, the first major legal crash of public money and venture capital and investment, that people were starting to see these mammoth pot companies trading under $10. With that, you have a lot of buzz on the horizon about, Johns Hopkins University becoming the first psychedelic center, and efforts at Imperial College, and movies like Fantastic Fungi with Paul Stamets and Dosed, and other initiatives like Decriminalized Nature, and Denver, and the efforts of the people. I mean, I'm an advisor to the folks at Spore Denver, and I mean, that was some of the
very good friends of mine, actually. Yep.
Yeah, no, good people. And so really what's happening is the crossover is that there is, in some regards, a association that, hey, cannabis and psychedelics of varying kinds are controlled and restricted drugs. But there is this interest that where people were intrigued with cannabis, that some of that has been replaced by psychedelics. So from the point of view of a conference promoter, they want to fill seats. And so the slight pivot is to make the cannabis names they've built relevant, but to capitalize on the emerging psychedelic market.
Yeah, I think, similar to early days with cannabis conferences, though, this has shifted significantly in cannabis, but I don't think it's psychedelic. Nobody's quite sure where the money is right now. I mean, everybody's learning. Everybody is supportive of research and figuring out the best ways to do that in an efficient and forward-moving way. But as far as I can tell, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's still very nebulous, like where this is going and to what end and how you might be able to capitalize on it, even in a structure where it's really mostly about the medicinal and wellness benefits of these products, is not clear. Is that an accurate statement? We're just sort of wandering in the wilderness to see where the door is at the moment, or the pathway out of the forest, rather?
Well, I think the rules and where we're at is very clear. The problem is again, most of the market, just as we saw with cannabis, had blinders on, and then legalization came and the blinders are off and people have no idea, Baker's chocolate from Belgian chocolate. And the same is with psychedelics, because you have a lot of these startup companies, and not all of them are air, but a lot of them, it's window dressing, jockeying, and positioning to be able to do something that, will there be a return on investment on the millions and tens of millions of dollars that some of these companies are spending to try to get the government to listen to them? Which, again, you have to wonder who's making money and where. And I think it's, again, I advise companies, you have to be very careful, because even reading press releases and explaining to people that, look, if you had the experience and you're sitting where I'm sitting, you'd realize that back in the old cannabis days, the people that had significant illegal grows and were producing cannabis at a large scale, unfortunately, they were being done under bogus R&D licenses in conjunction with legitimate universities, legitimate labs, and so on. I mean, the Nikki Sands lab at UBC, where I did my undergraduate, that was all being an illicit LSD lab, was being done in the geology department labs. And my first day as an undergrad, it was in the cover, the bust of that. So traditionally what you're seeing—
I hope you didn't just expose a bunch of people.
But that nexus of research institutions,
Yes.
big science, and infrastructure is now trying to be replicated by startups. And at the end of the day, you're looking at what, when will these companies hit a break-even point and be doing something that isn't dependent on either ministerial access, which really boils down to the profile and the need of the patient, or a physician access through SAP, which again, doctors aren't trained in this area yet. There's maybe this many I can think of who could, but the demand and the class of accessible patient is really limited now to end-of-life palliative PTSD, cancer-resistant treatment, end-of-life PTSD. So there's that on one side, but then at the end of the day, psychedelics again aren't new. And really you have to look at this with the lens of drug development on one hand versus companies that have no IP. So it's one of those reasons that people retain folks like myself to ensure that if they're going to spend money, they know that before they spend a lot more money, that at least they're going to be able to do something and not die on the vine, hoping that either their mousetrap is selected or that a thin legislative or regulatory advantage will be conferred in their favor.
Yeah, well, from a broad perspective, all of what we're talking about is thousands of years old, right? And so now we're talking about how do we sort of mainstream and create acceptance for this discussion, which I think over the long term is going to be truly a health and wellness and medical discussion. We're going to stop using words like adult use, recreational, and as it evolves, it really becomes, yes, health and wellness products. What are the differences between functional mushrooms and psilocybin, and how does that work? And same thing with cannabis. It's not about standing around a flagpole smoking a joint. It's about what are the health benefits and the various consumption methods that we can get there. I think
you highlight a really good point there, because we have to also remember that the Food and Drug and the FDA framework and how medical and scientific research is done, both regarding cannabis and psychedelics, that deck is totally stacked. So before we can even do the research to justify what we take for granted as anecdote and accepted practice and science, unfortunately, with the way the rules are written, we still have to go through a plethora of clinical, expensive research and undoing of what's been done in order to go forward before we ultimately have something that looks like something that you can take to the bank.
Yep. Well, and we also have to, I work with a lot of people doing research around the world, whether it's in Australia or Italy or Paraguay or Mexico. And we have to also get it to a point where people are willing to listen across borders, right? If there is good, valid research being done in a different place, just because it's not done in your backyard doesn't mean it sucks, right? And so being able to cross-pollinate these discussions has been very interesting for me. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in South Florida, small conference really that I think has a ways to go. But at the same time, it was so interesting to me to see who was walking through those halls, right? These are folks that have been in the space for years. And the reason they were there is because it was a cross pollination of the cannabis discussion and the psychedelics discussion. And I know for a fact that several of the people walking through those halls were there pretty much to pick up market intelligence that they will now turn around and present as their own at really large scale events later on in the year. But getting those conversations happening is critical. I've been pleased to see, even within the Global Cannabis Network Collective, our members collaborating on, multinational research projects trying to figure this stuff out. So intriguing to say the least. So Robert, as we move forward over the next, say, 12, 18 months, if you want to take a dive and really go 24 to 36, you can as well. But where do you see this crossover between these conversations really going in that sort of short to midterm landscape? And as you're advising clients about where to look for opportunity or where you think they can go and be successful, what are you telling them? So what's that lens looking like?
Right. It's a great question. Well, cannabis is pretty easy. I mean, nothing's going to happen in Canada significantly in the next 5 months, but in the next 18 months to 2 years, there was initially a 5-year moratorium put into significant changes of the Cannabis Act. I guess it's because the government wanted to give those initial companies such an established 5-year head start before completely changing things. And well, the way that Canadian legalization has worked, it's worked so well that that there will be cases to change things, because we haven't seen this spike in numbers and drug driving and kids, and in fact all these numbers have gone the other way, demonstrating that a lot of the sensible retail access needs to be amended. So I expect some big changes there, but I also think that nothing in Canada will be done without further discussion with the United States on, okay, how do we now begin to harmonize what this looks like? Because Canada is still technically doing what they're doing is illegal at the UN. But just like as the Netherlands have been doing this since the 72, right? What kind of repercussions are there really? Now, there would be if Canada was shipping rec weed internationally. So, but again, I just see things really as being in a bit of a holding pattern until the Canadian government makes these changes, because again, you jump into the cannabis space now, you don't know if your model or your strategy is going to be even relevant. And that really applies to the psychedelic space. And so if you don't do anything, you're not really in a good position, but you have to be doing something to ensure that you're in a position that at least government and regulators will listen to you. And so that's what we're seeing at the moment. All of these groups, one way or another, are trying to jockey for the government to do something. And I know enough to know that there will be something down the pipe, but will it be something that amounts to something profitable? It's yet to be determined, because at the end of the day, any of these companies that get tapped to, say, supply psilocybin or produce a licensed regulated supply, whether it's synthetic, GUMP, lab grade, or a natural extraction, you're competing with a $40 bag of mushrooms in the black market.
Yeah.
So there needs to, again, be access and rules that people will accept and engage in, or else it'll just end up being like we've seen in cannabis, being two-tiered.
Yep. Well, and Lord, I mean, geez, in the United States, right, we're watching New York come online, and they keep making the same mistakes that California has made, basically reinforcing a cannabis black market and making it almost impossible to operate legally. It's always sad to me that governments don't seem capable of learning over time, even. And I think we'll see a lot of that same thing repeat in psychedelics. I mean, we have decriminalization campaigns in some markets, which is helpful, but again, that's not a method of success for business. So I think you're right. It's a wait and see continue to educate and engage as much as possible, but then see how it continues to play out. I have to credit a lot of these early movers, though, in truly driving conversation. I mean, groups like Spore in Denver had a big impact in furthering that conversation in Colorado, and I know other similar groups around the world are continuing to challenge that as well. So
you highlight an interesting point, though, because again, there's decriminalization, which these groups have championed, and there's what, about at least 5+ major US cities that are decriminalized, but that says absolutely nothing about what is a legal regulated market going to look like. What folks have to remember is that's a decision by state prosecution and federal prosecution services that have looked at, hey, we're getting caught up in busting white people from the right side of the tracks with possession of psilocybin, and they look at it as, we need to divert people that shouldn't be in the criminal justice system out of that so we can prosecute the serious offenses.
So I do have to point out, Robert, I mean, you dropped a hand grenade in the middle of that comment, because you're absolutely right. There is, and we need to highlight the fact that the social inequities that exist across all of these markets, whether it's the United States and Europe, anywhere around the world.
But that's the reality. You had white kids getting busted for microdosing, and that then leading into, coupled with, in the last 2 years, of course, we've looked at these other movements that have highlighted issues that show the discrimination. But that, unfortunately, is when you look at instances of, in Canada, the Crown Prosecution Service, they look at it from a point of view of decriminalization is to divert out of criminal justice to free up the resources to go after the murderers and the rapists. Yeah. But unfortunately, that gives folks an impression that, wow, okay, now I can start treating people because it's decriminalized. But most of these efforts that you see where you are granted by the regulator, it's not for a commercial purpose. It's more to do with a human rights or a constitutional or a policy ground, nothing more, or that which says nothing about how the rollout or access and any kind of a commercial framework. So that's not to say that companies aren't doing. I mean, there's companies doing amazing things. But the reality is it's why I love being a lawyer and an advisor is, government changes the law, we advise our clients, and then the government changes the law again. It's the circle of life. So,
yep. And you asked early on, who is making money? And I can tell you the lawyers certainly are. The hope is that others continue as well. And, I'm going to wrap up the show. We're a little over time, but I do think, we've got to come back, Robert, and talk again. I actually thought it'd be great to get maybe some of the folks that we work with in the social equity space on, talk about the additional sort of ramifications of that, because while we graze the surface, being able to champion not only the health and wellness aspects of these different plants and mushrooms and everything else that we're talking about, but also talking about how do we create businesses that are responsible, sustainable, socially equitable, and profitable across all of these different regions, I think is a task that government has generally proven they're incapable of doing. And so it sits on those of us who are actively in the market to champion these causes as much as we can. So, Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's been great, and thank you to all of you out there in podcast land for listening to the International Cannabis Conversation. We love having you on this journey around the world as we go, and please don't hesitate to email in questions, engage with us on social media, and if you haven't yet, for crying out loud, hit the subscribe button, because that's the only way that I can be sure that you're getting it every time we come out. So Robert, again, thank you so much. And thank you everybody, Gateway Proven Strategies, the Global Cannabis Network Collective, and trichomes.com for letting me continue to enjoy these bi-weekly explorations into cannabis, and this week, psychedelics. Talk to you all soon.